Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's presentation on Tony Bennett's Birth of the Museum. I'll begin with a brief overview of the work. It was written by Tony Bennett and published in 1995. It has a straightforward structure with an introduction and 3 parts with 3 chapters for each part. Bennett's explicitly stated purpose is to provide a politically focused genealogy for the modern public museum. In particular, Bennett focuses on developments of the mid-19th century, which influenced the public museum and other institutions of the exhibitionary complex, including fairs, museums, and expositions. As suggested by Bennett's choice of words, politically focused, this is not a strict narrative of the history of the public museum. Bennett focuses on the political, social, and academic developments which influenced the display and design of museums and expositions. In his introduction, Bennett gives a brief overview of the theoretical sources which influence his arguments. Among those listed are Gramsci, Bordeaux, and Ryan, among others. However, Foucault is probably the most influential among Bennett's theoretical sources. Foucault's ideas are incorporated throughout the birth of the museum, in one degree or another. Bennett juxtaposes the development of the museum with that of the development of the prison system, or the carceral archipelago, as described by Foucault. Foucault posits that the sciences treat humanity as both the object of examination as well as the subject of knowledge, an idea Bennett discusses. Bennett also incorporates Foucault's conception of evolutive time, which describes how power is exercised as progress is made towards a terminal point. And these are just a few of Foucault's ideas that Bennett incorporates. In the first part of the birth of the museum, Bennett traces developments of the 17th and 18th centuries which impacted the development of the modern museum. Bennett explains the transition from royal collections and the demonstration of power among the ruling elite to the mid-19th century conception of museums as a space for public instruction. Not just public instruction in an academic sense, but public instruction in how to behave in social settings, where the working class can, quote, learn to civilize themselves, end quote. Bennett also discusses how architecture was used in exhibitionary spaces as a way of making the public self-regulating, such as the use of open space and large panes of sheet glass. Bennett also traces developments in the scientific disciplines, which influenced the way in which objects were arranged in museums. Initially, objects were arranged with the guiding principle of rarity or uniqueness. With the development of fields like geology, paleontology, and anthropology, came a revealed narrative of the evolutionary development of humanity. Objects became arranged to represent this narrative, and visitors could become progressive subjects, seeing themselves as participating in evolutionary development. Or it could be said the museum produced a progressive effect on its visitors, educating the public and elevating the social behavior of the working class. In Part 2, Bennett discusses politics and policies within the museum. In the post-war period of the late 20th century, museums began to focus on the lives of everyday people. However, a trend emerged from this focus in which the people, quote, served as vehicles for the nostalgic remembrance of sentimentalized past, end quote. The history of ordinary people was, in effect, depoliticized. Bennett uses the open-air museum at Beamish as a case study to illustrate this trend. He contrasts this with the Hyde Park Barracks and the People's Palace of Glasgow, which incorporate the people's politics into their museum narratives. Although these museums display similar objects, Bennett explains, the difference is found in how these objects are arranged and interpreted, and from what frameworks museums are approaching these objects and the people they represent. According to Bennett, the textual properties of museums influence the ways in which history is organized and represented in the museum space, by the use of captions, videos, guidebooks, souvenirs, and the like. Out of these textual properties arise questions regarding what the museum wishes for its visitors to take away from their experience, or what values are being represented through the museum's narrative, or how the past is represented in relation to the present. Bennett uses the history of Australia as a case study to examine these textual properties and explore these questions. In the final part of the birth of the museum, Bennett addresses the museum's fixation on the theme of progress. Bennett describes how each museum type, whether it be a natural, a history, or an art museum, displays its own narrative, summarizing, quote, "Each museum, then, is like a chapter within a longer story, pressing towards an endpoint, which is simultaneously the point at which the next chapter commences." End quote. That is to say, when the museum's narrative ends, the visitor picks it up and moves it forward, beginning the next chapter of development. Bennett also describes how the museum's selective affinities led to the marginalization of women and people of other cultures, and how they were represented in this narrative progress. Women were reduced to the function of childbearing, and other cultures were perceived to be primitive and not as far along in the evolutionary track as the European white male, which was depicted as the ideal. Bennett continues this discussion of progress and development by examining the relationship between expositions and modernity. Expositions mark the achievements of humanity, as well as celebrations of national modernity, such as centennial celebrations. The host nation of the exposition intends to present itself on the international stage as one of modernity's best examples. The host city is also folded into this presentation of modernity, striving to put its best foot forward. Bennett uses Brisbane's Expo 88 as an example to explore these ideas. The emphasis was not so much on objects, but on how objects were displayed and the technology incorporated in those displays. The exposition provided a space where visitors can be trained in future practices and trends, allowing them to, in a sense, participate in the future. As far as contemporary responses, I found a mix of reviews. Handler praises Bennett as an incisive thinker who is well informed both theoretically and historically, who writes clearly about complex issues. On the other hand, Soaps describes the birth of the museum as, quote, "a frustrating book to read," end quote. Soaps criticizes Bennett's convoluted writing style, his dependency on references and quotations from other thinkers and writers, and Bennett's failure to introduce new ideas or themes, concluding the book fails to move us forward in our understanding of museum history. Swift himself has a mixed review of Bennett's work. Overall, he has a positive response towards it, calling it a stimulating and valuable contribution to museum and cultural studies. But he also criticizes the book, believing it does not go far enough in its questioning, like why and how the museum moved away from its self-regulating purpose. Or do museums reflect the intentions of its creators? My main criticism of the work, and one that is echoed by Soaps and Swift, is the redundancy of Bennett's points. Because each chapter is actually an essay that was published independent of the others, Bennett retreads the same ground over and over throughout the book. Soaps and Swift note there was no effort made to create a cohesive narrative among these various articles and essays. I also agree with Soaps's critique of Bennett's writing style, that it is convoluted and run-on sentences abound throughout the book. I believe it is also true that Bennett relies a little too much on referencing and directly quoting the work of others, particularly Foucault and Gramsci. Although it may be true that Bennett has not introduced any new themes or arguments in this book, this was my first encounter with this type of history of the museum. So I still found the book to be very interesting and worth the read, and Bennett introduced new ideas to me anyway. So in what ways is Bennett's work relevant to our course? First, there is Bennett's point that the modern museum conditions society to perceive itself in the process of progress and development. Secondly, the way in which women and people of other cultures were represented in museums was heavily and negatively influenced by Western patriarchal society. There were those who were deemed as primitive, perceived as behind in evolutionary development. Women were reduced to their, quote, essential function, end quote, of childbearing, and seen as ever inferior to the male form. This soundly demonstrates the ways in which cultural and social understandings invade institutions of education and permit the perpetuation of false narratives, which cast dispersion on those who are seen as lesser than. Furthermore, the textual properties of the museum and the way in which it chooses to interpret objects and their meaning influence how society perceives itself. how it perceives its values, and how it perceives other communities. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to reading your discussion posts.